Our exploration begins with the word itself, for within language, history is preserved. The term nightmare descends from the Old English mare, a malevolent entity from Germanic folklore. The mare was a goblin or demon believed to crouch upon the sleeper's chest, a suffocating weight that brought with it a profound sense of paralysis and impending doom. This early framework conceptualized the nightmare as a visitation from a mythological force that encroached upon the vulnerability of sleep. This belief is a ubiquitous feature of humanity's attempt to give form to this terror. We find its shadow in the seductive yet deadly incubus and succubus of medieval Christian lore, demonic beings who were believed to engage in spectral assaults that violated and stole the soul. In the folklore of Catalonia, we encounter the Passanta, a monstrous black dog that creeps in to steal the breath, a brute force that pins the individual to the threshold between life and death. And in Japan, the phenomenon of sleep paralysis is known as kanashibari, traditionally attributed to the work of spirits or vengeful ghosts. This mythological framework was the primary lens for the comprehension of nightmares. It gave a name and a face to the horror, a projection of an ineffable inner terror onto a tangible outer form. Myths are public dreams. Dreams are private myths. The study of nightmares underwent a profound transformation in the 20th century with the emergence of psychoanalysis. Freud initiated this shift, drawing on the insights of the ancients while turning attention inward to the internal structure of the mind. He emphasized the unconscious as a central force in the formation of nightmares, a realm whose nature remains as mysterious to us as the external world itself. Properly speaking, the unconscious is the real psychic. Its inner nature is just as unknown to us as the reality of the external world, and it is just as imperfectly reported to us through the data of consciousness as is the external world through the indications of our sensory organs. Carl Jung deepened this foundational insight. For Jung, the monster in the dream constituted an autonomous personification of a rejected part of the personality. Crucially, Jung's work completed a cycle. It took the newly internalized psychological phenomenon and reconnected it to the timeless, mythological forms of the collective unconscious. His advance was to recognize that the personal demon often wears a universal, archetypal mask. Thus, the psychological perspective assimilated our mythological intuition, recognizing myth as the very language the psyche uses to speak of itself. From this historical evolution, we arrive at our current understanding, a dialectical model of the nightmare. It is a phenomenon that exists at the intersection of psychology and mythology. The nightmare originates with an internal psychological reality. This internal content, however, is too potent or too alien for the ego to integrate directly. The psyche projects this internal drama onto an external, archetypal form, drawn from the collective unconscious. A personal feeling of rage is personified as a demon. A repressed creative potential is personified as a devouring monster. The terror we feel is the terror of our own rejected content, amplified and given numinous power by the archetypal form it now wears. The nightmare, then, is a message from the deepest part of ourselves, delivered by a figure that is at once intimately personal and terrifyingly universal. Confronted with such a potent internal reality, the conscious ego tends to resort to one of two primal yet ultimately flawed strategies. The first is the reckless confrontational response, the path of the warrior. In the dream and in waking reflection, the impulse is to fight, to attack, to kill the monstrous figure. This approach, however, is psychologically counterproductive. It is an act of self-mutilation, an attack on a living part of one's own psyche. This strategy only deepens the internal split it seeks to resolve. It is a manifestation of a one-sided psychological ideal, an attempt by the ego to be purely good, strong, or rational by violently suppressing its opposite. This creates an unsustainable psychic tension. Just as the idealized all-good figure of Christ in dogmatic theology necessitates the creation of an equally absolute Antichrist, an ego that strives for one-sided perfection will inevitably generate a correspondingly dark and powerful shadow. As Carl Jung states in his work, Ion, if we see the traditional figure of Christ as a parallel to the psychic manifestation of the self, then the Antichrist would correspond to the shadow of the self, namely, the dark half of the human totality. To attack the nightmare figure is to declare war on this shadow, guaranteeing that the internal conflict will not only continue, but escalate. The second flawed response is avoidance, the path of pure victimization. This is the impulse to flee, to ignore, to suppress, or to medicate the nightmare into silence. This strategy, while less overtly violent, is no less damaging. It is an abdication of consciousness. By refusing to engage with the nightmare, the ego cedes all power to the unconscious figure. The repressed content, ignored and invalidated, does not disappear. It gathers strength in the darkness, continuing to exert its influence from below. This leads to a state of psychological helplessness, a sense that one is the passive victim of inexplicable moods, anxieties, and compulsions. The monster is not slain, but is instead allowed to rule the kingdom from the shadows. There is, however, a third way, a path that lies between confrontation and avoidance, between the reckless courage of the warrior and the hypersensitivity of the victim. This is the method of nightmare rescripting, a form of active imagination that invites the dreamer to re-enter the dreamscape and engage in a conscious dialogue with the antagonist. It cultivates a posture of controlled bravery and measured humility, allowing the nightmare to express itself, while the dreamer remains present and aware. Its fundamental goal is to understand and integrate the message of the nightmare, transforming it from an object of terror into a catalyst for true psychological growth. Before we continue, we strongly encourage you to install Mirror. The app is the practical side of this channel, where you can put into practice everything you learn. Because we don't want to just teach you the theory, we want you to experience it and learn to apply it by yourself. Download Mirror now by clicking on the link in the top right corner and begin your journey into your subconscious. To understand the method of nightmare rescripting, we must first understand the psychology of terror. Before we can speak of the parts, we must first delineate the whole. The ground of all our experience, conscious and unconscious, is the psyche. The term originates from the Greek psyche, meaning breath, spirit, and soul. It signifies the animating principle, the invisible yet undeniable force that gives life to the body. This etymological root is crucial, for it affirms the primordial understanding of the psyche as the very source of life and autonomous activity, a conception that stands apart from any model that would reduce it to an epiphenomenon of the brain. The psyche can be defined as the totality of all mental processes. It is the complete psychic sphere, a vast and largely unknown space that encompasses not only our consciousness, but also the unconscious. As Carl Jung establishes in Ion, the psyche rests upon two seemingly distinct but inseparable bases, the somatic and the psychic itself. The somatic basis is inferred from the totality of endosomatic perceptions, which represents our awareness or perception of our internal bodily states. The psychic basis, in turn, is the totality of both conscious and unconscious contents. Therefore, the psyche contains our personal history, our biological instincts, and our shared human heritage, a holistic system that bridges mind and body. The most familiar component of this totality is the ego. The ego is the organ of our waking identity, the seat of our subjective awareness. As Jung writes in Ion, the ego, the subject of all personal acts of consciousness, appears to be the center of the field of consciousness, and insofar as this comprises the empirical personality, the ego is the complex factor to which all conscious contents are related. It is the I that thinks, feels, and acts, the subject who perceives an object, the point of reference for all that we consider to be our personal experience. It is through the ego that we achieve continuity of memory and a coherent sense of self. The ego, however, does not constitute the entire psyche. Its domain is limited to the field of consciousness, and this field always finds its limit when it comes up against the unknown. This unknown is twofold. There is the unknown of the outer world, which we perceive through our senses, and the unknown of the inner world, which we call the unconscious. The ego, therefore, stands upon the shore of a vast interior reality. It is an acquired complex, arising, as Jung writes, from the collision between the somatic factor and the environment. As a product of the psyche, it remains distinct from its source. Its very existence is predicated upon a deeper, more extensive reality from which it has emerged and to which it remains inextricably bound. This is why Jung concludes, although its bases are in themselves relatively unknown and unconscious, the ego is a conscious factor par excellence. As the ego develops its specific character, its moral values, its ideals, its sense of what is acceptable, it inevitably creates an other within the psyche. This other side, composed of all the qualities, impulses, and potentials that the ego has rejected, repressed, or simply failed to recognize, is the shadow. It is the unacknowledged and often unconscious part of the ego personality. It is what we are, but what we would rather not be. The formation of the shadow is a necessary consequence of becoming conscious. In choosing what we are, in cultivating certain virtues and behaviors, we must also choose what we are not. This unchosen part does not cease to exist. Its psychic energy is not annihilated, but is only relegated to the darkness of the unconscious, from where it continues to influence our moods and actions. We must distinguish between two aspects of this figure. The first is the dark shadow, which contains the repressed negative traits and destructive impulses of the personality. It is the repository of our envy, our greed, our rage, our lust, all the animal instincts that conflict with the civilized persona we present to the world. It is the sum of all those reprehensible qualities we like to deny in ourselves, but can easily see in others. It is this aspect of the shadow that most often populates our nightmares with figures of menace and terror. Yet there is also the golden shadow. This aspect contains our repressed positive potentials, our undeveloped talents, our dormant creativity, our authentic vitality, and our deepest spiritual aspirations. These too can be relegated to the unconscious if they conflict with the ego's limited self-concept or the demands of its environment. An individual raised in a pragmatic, materialistic family might repress their innate artistic or spiritual sensibility. This potential, full of life, becomes part of the shadow. In a dream, it might appear as a terrifying, chaotic, but beautiful figure, a wild nature spirit that threatens the ego's orderly but sterile world. This demonstrates how even good things become dangerous when left in the unconscious. The reason nightmare figures often feel so alien and possess such an overwhelming power is explained by the shadow's inherent nature. As Jung explains in Ion, closer examination of the dark characteristics, that is, the inferiorities constituting the shadow, reveals that they have an emotional nature, a kind of autonomy, and accordingly an obsessive, or better, possessive quality. Because its contents are charged with the energy of repression, they function as an autonomous complex, a splinter psyche that can and does act independently of the ego's conscious will. This autonomy is most apparent during moments when the ego's control is weakened. Jung observes that effects occur usually where adaptation is weakest, and at the same time they reveal the reason for its weakness, namely a certain degree of inferiority and the existence of a lower level of personality. The nightmare antagonist is precisely this autonomous shadow complex, breaking through into the theater of the mind during sleep. When we fail to integrate the shadow consciously, its contents are projected. In waking life, we project it onto other people, seeing our own faults in our neighbors. This projection, Jung notes, changed the world into the replica of one's own unknown face. In the dream state, however, there is no external object for the projection. It is cast upon an internal figure, forcing a confrontation with this unknown face. The shadow is a moral problem that challenges the whole ego personality, for no one can become conscious of the shadow without considerable moral effort. To become conscious of it involves recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. The integration of the shadow therefore moves beyond intellectual exercise into the realm of a deep ethical and existential task. Given the terror it inspires, it is natural to view the nightmare as a purely destructive event, a psychic malfunction. From a functional perspective, however, the nightmare serves a purposeful, if painful, role as a communication from the psyche. We may use the metaphor of a play. The psyche as a whole is the playwright, and its ultimate goal is the complete and balanced expression of the total personality. The ego is the primary audience member, who out of fear, pride, or simple ignorance, has chosen to watch only one act of the play, the one that aligns with its own self-image. The rest of the script, containing essential plot developments and character arcs, is left unread. The nightmare, in this metaphor, is a recurring and dramatic scene from the play's unacknowledged second act. The nightmare figure is the lead actor in this scene, a personification of the rejected shadow. Its terrifying appearance is a dramatic attempt to capture the ego's attention. Because the ego is asleep or has turned its back on the stage, the actor must resort to extreme measures, shouting its lines, wearing a monstrous mask, performing acts of shocking violence. The repetition of the nightmare, the same chase, the same paralysis, the same monster, is the psyche's stubborn insistence that this part of the story must be witnessed. The recurring plot is a message, a symbolic representation of an inner imbalance that requires conscious acknowledgement. The more one-sided the conscious attitude, the more threatening and monstrous the compensatory figure in the dream will appear. The nightmare thus reveals itself as a form of psychological compensation, a desperate attempt by the total psyche to force the one-sided ego to turn around and face what it has been ignoring. It is a summons to wholeness, delivered in the language of terror because the ego has refused to listen to gentler whispers. The contents of the shadow are shaped by personal experience, yet the forms they take often transcend the purely personal. The shadow frequently manifests using primordial images drawn from the collective unconscious, and this is the role of the archetype. The word derives from the Greek arche, meaning original or first principle, and typos, meaning imprint or pattern. Archetypes are the original imprints of human experience. To grasp this concept, we must follow Jung in distinguishing between the personal and the collective unconscious. The personal unconscious contains contents that were once conscious, but have been forgotten or repressed. It is the repository of an individual's unique life history. The collective unconscious, however, is a deeper and more universal layer of the psyche. As Jung writes in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, this deeper layer I call the collective unconscious. In contrast to the personal psyche, it has contents and modes of behavior that are more or less the same everywhere and in all individuals. It is an inherited psychic structure, a shared legacy of all humanity. Its contents are the archetypes, which Jung describes as innate, universal patterns of experience, forms without content. He clarifies this with a powerful analogy. Its form, however, might perhaps be compared to the axial system of a crystal, which, as it were, preforms the crystalline structure in the mother liquid, although it has no material existence of its own. Personal experience is the solution in which these pre-existent formal patterns crystallize, giving them specific, individual content. The archetypes are the reason our private nightmares so often resemble public myths. A personal fear of one's own unbridled anger, a content of the personal shadow, becomes immeasurably more terrifying when it crystallizes around the archetypal pattern of the demon. It is then amplified by the weight and power of all human experience with destructive rage. This archetypal amplification is what gives nightmares their profound, often metaphysical quality of terror. The monster that chases us in the dark is a timeless figure, an ancient enemy that has pursued humanity through the long night of its history. And it is this connection to a primordial, transpersonal power that grants the nightmare its overwhelming and fascinating reality. A superficial critique of the rescripting method might suggest that it is a form of sophisticated avoidance, a repression that seeks to paper over the terrifying reality of the unconscious with a placid fantasy. Such an interpretation, however, mistakes the nature of the engagement. The rescripting method does not deny the ontological status of the nightmare figure or the terror it evokes. It does not propose that the dreamer simply imagine the monster away. Rather, it proposes a radical shift in the mode of relation to that figure. It is a movement from a logic of opposition to a logic of engagement. The process is predicated on the understanding that the nightmare is a communication from a part of the self. Therefore, to eliminate its messenger is to refuse its message. This path is more, not less, demanding than reckless confrontation or pure victimization. It requires a form of courage that can hold the tension of the opposites without collapsing into a premature and violent resolution. The essence of this philosophy finds its perfect allegorical expression in the fairy tale of Beauty and the Beast. The Beast is the archetypal figure of the terrifying other. He is a prince, a figure of royal potential, trapped within a monstrous, animalistic form. He lives in an enchanted castle, a domain of the unconscious, isolated from the human world by his terrifying aspect and his own despair. He personifies a powerful, noble psychic content that has been cut off from consciousness and rendered monstrous by this separation. The tale commences with the figure of the father trespassing the beast's domain. He symbolizes the conventional, rational ego, an entity well adapted to the external, civilized world, yet profoundly naive regarding the inner realm. His journey into the beast's domain is therefore a symbolic representation of the ego's accidental stumbling into the autonomous space of the unconscious. Naturally, he commits a crucial error, an act of hubris rooted in ignorance. He seeks to appropriate a profound symbol, the rose, treating it as a mere commodity to be possessed and given as a gift. The rose, in this context, is a sort of rosa mystica, the alchemical symbol of the soul's highest attainment. It represents the very treasure the shadow guards, the secret of wholeness and the promise of transformation. The father's action thus demonstrates the ego's characteristic initial approach to the numinous. It operates under the illusion that it can extract a potent component for its own superficial purposes and depart without consequence. This transactional logic of acquisition is fundamentally inadequate for engaging with the autonomous powers of the psyche. Such powers cannot be owned. The consequence of this trespass is immediate and absolute. He becomes the beast's prisoner. Belle's arrival marks the beginning of the true engagement. She does not come as a conqueror, but as a sacrifice, offering herself in her father's place. She moves willingly toward the source of terror. Her initial response is, naturally, one of fear and repulsion, the typical reaction of the ego to the shadow. Yet she does not adopt the warrior's stance. She does not seek a weapon to slay the beast, nor does she adopt the victim's stance by languishing in pure terror. Instead, her method is one of presence, dialogue, and compassion. She sits at his table, she listens to his nightly proposal, she begins to perceive the profound suffering that lies beneath the monstrous exterior. She treats the beast as a subject in pain to be understood. This relational stance is the central mechanism of transformation. The beast's monstrous form is dissolved by an act of love and acceptance. When Belle declares her love for him, she is performing the ultimate act of psychological integration. She is consciously acknowledging and embracing the feared and rejected part of the psyche. This act of compassion is the solvent that breaks the curse, allowing the monstrous form to fall away and the hidden prince, the golden shadow, to emerge. The rescripting process follows precisely this allegorical model. The dreamer, like Belle, must learn to turn toward the monster, to offer it something other than violence or fear. and to ask the questions that can begin the dialogue of transformation. This allegorical wisdom is mirrored in the great philosophical traditions of the West. The fundamental goal of this process is integration, a principle best understood as the conjunctio oppositorum, meaning the union of opposites. A nightmare signifies a psyche in a state of extreme opposition, of violent separation where one part is at war with another. The philosophy of engagement exemplified by Bell is the beginning of this conjunctio, the work of reuniting the torn polarities. This work of integration requires a specific relational stance, one articulated most clearly in the philosophy of Martin Buber. Buber distinguishes between two fundamental modes of being, the I-it and the I-thou. The I-it relationship is the default mode of the confrontational or avoidant ego. It treats the other, be it a person, an object, or a nightmare figure, as an it, an object to be analyzed, used, controlled, or eliminated. This stance maintains the separation between subject and object. The I-thou relationship, in contrast, is a mode of true encounter. It addresses the other as a thou, a subject with its own independent reality and inner life. It is a relationship of presence and mutuality. The Rescripting method is a conscious attempt to shift from an I-it to an I-thou relationship with the figures of the unconscious. The monster is no longer an it to be feared or slain, but a thou to be addressed. As Buber states, I require a thou to become I. This deep paradox lies at the heart of the philosophy of engagement. The ego cannot achieve wholeness, cannot become a true I, by objectifying and attempting to destroy its own shadow. It is only through the courageous act of entering into a relationship with its inner thou that the ego itself can be transformed and integrated into a larger identity. The allegorical journey of Bell, the conjunctio, and the philosophical I-thou relationship all converge on the same psychological end, a sacred marriage, or hieros gamos, between the conscious ego and the unconscious shadow. This is a union that creates a new, more robust and complete personality, instead of an annihilation of one by the other. This process of union has its own archetypal model within the psyche, a primordial image that informs and guides the entire endeavor. In his work, Ion, Jung refers to this image as the syzygy, the divine pair. The syzygy is the archetypal image of the paired opposites, often personified as a divine couple. Jung highlights the omnipresence of this motif, manifesting as the anima and animus, or in the alchemical imagery of the king and queen, or in the theological conception of Christ and his bride, the Church. He writes that when animus and anima meet, the animus draws his sword of power, and the anima ejects her poison of illusion and seduction. This describes the initial state of the nightmare, a state of conflict between antagonistic principles. The work of engagement, of dialogue, seeks to transform this antagonistic confrontation into a sacred union. The underlying archetypal pattern of the syzygy provides the psychic blueprint for this resolution. The goal of the Rescripting method is to consciously participate in this archetypal process, to move from a state of internal war to one of divine partnership, transforming the nightmare from a battlefield into the sacred space where the opposites can finally meet and unite. Having established the philosophical and psychoanalytical ground, we now turn to the practical application of nightmare rescripting. The foundational prerequisite for this work is the dream journal. You can use Mirror as your dream journal. It will enable you to organize all your dreams and discern key patterns across them. This active recording is the first and most essential step in the engagement. To write down a nightmare is to perform a conscious act of valuation. It lifts the experience from the evanescent, chaotic realm of nightmares and gives it a concrete form, making it an object of sustained study. This process of externalization is itself a powerful psychological intervention. It fixes the terrifying image, allowing the ego to establish a relationship with it from the stable ground of waking consciousness. The act of describing the dream is an act of honoring the dream's reality, a signal to the unconscious that its communications are being received and attended to. For this practice, you must keep a journal by your bedside. Upon waking from a nightmare, before moving or speaking, immediately record the experience. Even fragments, a single image, a feeling, are of immense value and should be documented, for they are often the threads that lead back to the heart of the psychic drama. This initial act of recording is comparable to the careful unearthing of an archaeological artifact. It must be done with precision and a respect for detail, for every element of the dream is a part of its total meaning. You write the narrative of the nightmare in the present tense. In this way, you recapture the immediacy of the experience, immersing your conscious mind back into the dream's emotional and sensory atmosphere, bypassing the ego's tendency to rationalize and diminish the event after the fact. The description must be as exhaustive as possible. You must describe the narrative and extensively document the sensations of the dream. What is the quality of the light? Is it dim, harsh, or unnaturally colored? What specific sounds are present? Are there smells, the scent of decay, of damp earth? Most importantly, you must record the bodily feelings experienced by the dream ego, a constricting tightness in the chest, a weight of paralysis, the frantic pounding of the heart. This meticulousness is important because the products of the unconscious serve a compensatory function. In the essay, The Psychology of the Child Archetype, Jung explains that the archetype's purpose is to compensate or correct, in a meaningful manner, the inevitable one-sidednesses and extravagances of the conscious mind. The conscious ego, in its necessary drive for clarity and focus, must exclude vast portions of psychic reality. The nightmare presents this excluded reality. The details that your conscious ego might dismiss are the very points where the unconscious is communicating most clearly, slipping its message past the ego's habitual filters. The strange color of a monster's eyes, the specific pattern on the floor, are clues, symbolic data that provide the specific context for the dream's central message. Once the dream has been fully documented, the next step is to diagnose the structure of its narrative. You must read through the written account and identify the pivotal moment of the dream. This is the narrative fulcrum upon which the dream's psychic energy turns from suspense to terror. It is the point of peripeteia, the moment of crisis where the dream ego loses its agency and the unconscious antagonist gains the upper hand. It is the instant before you begin to run, before you are finally caught. This moment must be located with precision, for it is the exact point where the conscious intervention of rescripting will be applied. It is the wound in the psychic fabric, and it is at the point of the wound that healing must begin. To aid in this diagnosis, you must ask a core question. What fundamental value or state of being is being threatened at this exact moment? Is the threat one of physical survival, of annihilation? Is it a threat to your identity, a fear of psychic dissolution or madness? Is it a threat to your moral integrity, a confrontation with an unbearable ethical failure? Or is it a threat to your connection with another, a terror of ultimate isolation? Naming this existential threat is the first step toward understanding the shadow's underlying message. The monster is a personification of a specific challenge to the ego's current state of being. Identifying the pivot point and the existential threat is the foundation for the conscious work of transformation. This diagnostic act is itself a step toward consciousness, for it requires the ego to look beyond the superficiality of fear and perceive the deeper structure of the psychic conflict. This stage is the core of the method, a form of structured active imagination. You are instructed to rewrite the dream's ending, beginning from the identified pivot point. The goal is to consciously alter the dream ego's reaction to the crisis. This is a conscious choice to engage with the shadow figure and transform the relationship with the antagonist. This act is a direct response to a fundamental psychological reality, as Jung states in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. This confrontation is the first test of courage on the inner way. we've at least brought up the personal unconscious. The shadow is a living part of the personality, and therefore wants to live with it in some form. The rescripting process consciously creates the confrontation that the dream ego, in its state of limited awareness and overwhelming fear, was unable to attempt. Like Bell, it is an attempt to love the shadow figure, if only for a moment, to hear its story and understand its purpose. This new script must be guided by a clear set of principles. The first principle is to substitute fear with curiosity. The primary emotional shift is from terror to inquiry. The question, "What is this?" must replace the exclamation, "This is terrifying." The second principle is to move toward, not away. The physical action must be the opposite of the original panicked response. You must consciously choose to turn and face the pursuer, to approach the source of terror. The third principle is to offer, not attack. The mode of interaction must shift from combat to dialogue. The impulse to destroy the figure is replaced with an offering, a question, a gesture of respect, a symbolic gift. The fourth principle is to assert conscious agency. Even in the face of overwhelming force, the new script must introduce a single, conscious choice that affirms the ego's presence. Writing the new script is an essential intellectual step. However, it is insufficient for a deep psychological transformation. The new narrative must be made experientially real. This is the purpose of the final step: imaginative rehearsal. You must find a quiet space, free from distraction, and enter a state of relaxed concentration. Closing your eyes, you visualize the nightmare, re-experiencing its atmosphere and its unfolding narrative. Upon reaching the pivot point, you must vividly and repeatedly imagine performing the new, rescripted action. This is a fully embodied visualization. You must focus on the feeling of the new choice. You must embody the sensation of fear transforming into curiosity, of helplessness giving way to a spark of agency. This rehearsal should be practiced multiple times until the new response feels as natural and immediate as the old one. As Jung writes, psychic existence can be recognized only by the presence of contents that are capable of consciousness. The contents of the collective unconscious are known as archetypes. The original nightmare is a powerful psychic content, a manifestation of an archetypal fear. The act of rehearsal is the act of creating a new psychic content, the conscious choice, the act of engagement, and making it equally real within the psyche. Through repeated embodiment, we create a new potential, a new pathway that can stand alongside and ultimately integrate the terrifying power of the archetypal shadow. Having explored the psychological and symbolic architecture of the nightmare, we now turn our attention to its material substrate. It is a necessary intellectual endeavor to understand the mechanisms through which the psyche's dramas are enacted within the human nervous system. We will examine the neurological principles that lend empirical support to the efficacy of the rescripting method. We move from the what of the psyche to the how of the brain, demonstrating a profound correspondence between the insights of psychoanalysis and the findings of modern neuroscience. The neurological basis for the rescripting method lies in the principle of memory reconsolidation. For a long time, memory was conceived as a static archive where experiences were filed away, immutable and fixed. Contemporary neuroscience, however, has revealed a far more dynamic process. Memory is an act of continual reconstruction. When a consolidated memory is recalled, its corresponding neural pathway enters a temporarily labile or malleable state. For a brief period, typically lasting a few hours, the memory is unstable and subject to modification before it is stored once again, or reconsolidated. This window of lability is the precise point of therapeutic intervention. The act of recalling the nightmare, as detailed in the previous chapter, is the key that unlocks the memory trace. The imaginative rehearsal of the new script is the introduction of new information during this critical phase. The original memory of the terror is not erased. Such a thing is neither possible nor desirable. Instead, we are creating a new, competing memory trace, one that is emotionally updated. The original narrative of terror becomes associated with a new, consciously chosen narrative of agency, dialogue, and resolution. Each rehearsal of the rescripted dream strengthens this alternative pathway, so that when the nightmare memory is triggered in the future, it is this new, integrated version that is more likely to come to the fore. This process allows for a fundamental rewriting of the fear association at the neural level, transforming a stimulus for terror into a prompt for conscious engagement. It is remarkable that a single reactivation seems to cause an old and consolidated memory to become labile again. Rescripting is the deliberate and systematic utilization of this natural psychic mechanism for therapeutic ends. This process of reconsolidation involves a complex interplay between several key regions of the brain, which we may conceptualize as a hierarchy of functions. At the most primal level is the amygdala, a pair of almond-shaped structures deep within the temporal lobes. The amygdala functions as the psyche's alarm system, the seat of our fear response. It is designed to learn and store fear associations with great speed and permanence, a crucial mechanism for survival. In the context of a nightmare, the amygdala is the source of the raw, physiological terror, the racing heart, the cold sweat, the impulse to flee. Working in concert with the amygdala is the hippocampus, which provides the contextual and narrative framework for the memory. If the amygdala is the alarm, the hippocampus is the librarian that retrieves the file, detailing why the alarm is sounding. It is responsible for the narrative elements of the dream, the specific monster, the particular location, the sequence of events. In a recurring nightmare, this amygdalo-hippocampal circuit becomes a deeply entrenched, self-reinforcing loop of terror and context. In opposition to these more primitive and automatic structures stands the prefrontal cortex, PFC, particularly its medial regions. The prefrontal cortex is the seat of executive function, conscious choice, reason, and emotional regulation. It is the director of the psyche, capable of observing, analyzing, and modulating the impulses that arise from deeper brain structures. Nightmare rescripting, then, can be understood as a form of top-down neural retraining. The conscious, deliberate act of imaginative rehearsal is an exercise of the prefrontal cortex. By repeatedly visualizing a new response to the dream's pivotal moment, the PFC sends new, inhibitory signals to the amygdala. It effectively retrains the alarm system, teaching it that the familiar context no longer needs to trigger a maximal fear response. This repeated practice strengthens the neural pathways from the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala, enhancing the ego's capacity for emotional regulation, even in the face of a terrifying internal stimulus. The true purpose of nightmare rescripting unfolds in the light of waking life. The dialogue with the shadow leads to the integration of its energy, enabling the individual to operate with a more complete and authentic character in waking life. This process cultivates a deeper form of virtue, the strength to contain and ethically manage one's total nature. To illustrate this process, let us consider a specific case. The dreamer is a man who, in his conscious life, is governed by a persona of unfailing agreeableness, an individual pathologically averse to conflict. This persona has become a psychological prison, preventing him from asserting his own needs or defending his own boundaries. His recurring nightmare is a classic expression of this inner imbalance. He is pursued relentlessly through a dark, tangled landscape by a furious, roaring lion. The dream invariably ends at the moment he is cornered, paralyzed by a terror that is absolute. In this nightmare, the lion is a perfect personification of the dreamer's disowned, instinctual rage. It is the devouring, ferocious, carnivorous aspect of his own life force, an energy so powerful and so contrary to his gentle ego ideal that it can only appear as a monstrous and deadly antagonist. Following the principles of our method, the dreamer begins the work of rescripting. He records the dream in all its sensory detail, the smell of the damp earth, the thunderous roar of the beast. He identifies the pivotal moment, the instant he is cornered, his back against a cold stone wall, the lion preparing to leap. This is the point of his utter helplessness. In the new script, instead of finding a hidden weapon or discovering a sudden avenue of escape, he performs the most difficult and courageous act possible. He stands his ground. He turns to face the lion, and in a confident gesture, he extends his open hand. In his imaginative rehearsals, he feels the terror, but he holds his position, visualizing his hand making contact with the lion's mane. He unites with his primal aggressivity. The integration has a profound impact on his waking life. The agreeable man gains conscious access to the aggressive energy the lion represents. He finds within himself the capacity to say no, to roar without guilt. He becomes capable of holding a contrary opinion in a discussion without being overwhelmed by the fear of disapproval. The lion's power, which had manifested as destructive rage in the unconscious, is now available to his conscious personality as the energy of self-assertion, of boundary, of passion. He has tamed the lion. He has begun to form a relationship with it. A one-sided personality, like that of the pathologically nice man, lives in a state of profound psychological fragility. By integrating the lion of rage, the dreamer is forced to confront the fact that his personality contains a powerful and dangerous polarity. As Jung writes, if it has been believed hitherto that the human shadow was the source of all evil, it can now be ascertained on closer investigation that the unconscious man, that is, his shadow, does not consist only of morally reprehensible tendencies, but also displays a number of good qualities, such as normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic insights, and creative impulses. The lion's energy, which seemed at first purely malevolent in the nightmare, is revealed to be the source of these very qualities. The normal instincts for self-preservation, the appropriate reactions needed to defend one's psychic space, and the creative impulses that give life its vitality and passion, all were contained within that terrifying form. The dreamer is thus compelled to hold the paradox of his own nature, that he is both the gentle man and the powerful lion. This ability to accept and live with internal polarity is a sign of psychological maturity, for it moves the individual beyond the naive and unstable opposition of good versus evil, into the more complex, integrated reality of the whole person. Our understanding of nightmares leads us to a foundational shift in perspective. The terror, which once seemed a paralyzing curse, is reframed as an opportunity. It is the psyche's raw, unfiltered invitation to become more whole. The same psychic energy that previously manifested as terror is now available to the conscious personality for creative and constructive use. The same psychic energy that previously manifested as terror is now available to the conscious personality for creative and constructive use. You have learned how to meet the most terrifying parts of yourself. You have been given the tools to begin a dialogue with the deepest, most powerful forces of your own nature. The only question left is, now that you know how to engage with this energy, will you have the courage to face it and embark on the path of wholeness? Thank you for watching the video. It was a pleasure having you on board. Do not let what you've learned today fade away. Download Mirror with the link in our description and take conscious ownership of your personal growth.